How do you even begin to scientifically study something as mysterious and, well, personal as the human mind? For the longest time, it just seemed impossible. But what if the problem wasn't the mind, but the questions we were asking? Today, we are diving deep into Noam Chomsky's radical rethinking of what the mind is and how language just might be the key to unlocking its biggest secrets.
And that really is the heart of the matter, isn't it? We have this tendency to think of the mind as something separate from the body, something almost magical, a ghost in the machine. But Chomsky challenges us to flip that idea on its head. He wants us to treat the mind not as some untouchable mystery, but as a biological system, an organ, that we can actually investigate, just like we study the heart or the immune system. Okay, so first things first. To even get started, we have to tackle this huge philosophical roadblock that's been in the way for hundreds of years. This idea that your mind and your body are two fundamentally different kinds of stuff. So you've probably heard of this classic idea, right? It comes mostly from the philosopher Descartes. He basically set up this huge split. The body, he said, was part of the physical world. It was like a machine, a complex clock that just followed the laws of physics. But the mind, well, the mind was something else entirely. It was non-physical, the home of our thoughts and our consciousness. And that right there is the famous mind-body problem. But here's the wild part and what this timeline really shows us. This famous problem was never really solved. It just dissolved. See, Descartes' whole idea of a body was based on simple mechanics. Things have to physically touch to make something happen. And then, boom, Isaac Newton comes along and completely revolutionizes physics. He shows that the physical world is way, way weirder than that, with these invisible forces like gravity acting over huge distances. All of a sudden, the physical world wasn't so simple anymore. The very definition of body kind of fell apart, and so did that old, neat division between a simple machine and a mysterious mind. So once you clear that old roadblock out of the way, you can actually start looking at what the mind does. And that brings us to the next big myth we need to bust, one that feels like total common sense, but might be completely wrong. And that's the idea that we learn language from scratch, that our minds are just a blank slate.
The story we all kind of grew up with is that kids learn to talk by listening, by imitating what their parents say, and by getting corrected when they make mistakes. Simple, right? But Chomsky's proposal is, well, it's completely different. He says language isn't really something a child learns to do, it's something that happens to the child. It's a lot more like growing an arm or going through puberty. It's a biological process that just unfolds on its own schedule, guided by an innate program that's already in there. And this is where we get to this really fascinating puzzle, sometimes called Plato's problem, or to put it another way, the poverty of the stimulus. The bottom line is this. Every child ends up with this incredibly rich, complex system of knowledge about their language, but the information they get from the world, what they hear from their parents, is actually pretty limited and often messy and incomplete. So where does all that extra knowledge come from?
All right, let's do a little experiment right now with your own brain. Just take a look at this really simple sentence. John expects to visit him.
And right away, instinctively, that him cannot be John. It has to be somebody else. You didn't have to think about it. You just knew.
Okay, ready? Now look at this tiny change. All we've done is tuck that first little phrase inside a bigger one. And just like that, the rule completely flips. In this sentence, him absolutely can be John. Again, you didn't have to work it out. Your brain just served you the answer on a platter. Isn't that wild?
So I've got to ask you, who taught you that? When did your parents or a teacher ever sit you down and explain this incredibly weird, abstract rule about how pronouns work in these specific kinds of sentences? The answer is almost certainly never. The answer, according to Chomsky, is nobody. You never learned it because it was already there. It grew, just like your arm grew. It's part of a shared biological blueprint for language, what he calls universal grammar. Think of it as the factory settings for human language that we're all born with. Our experience with a language like English or Japanese just flips the right switches. And that really matters because it means language isn't just some cultural tool we invented. It's a deep part of our biology. All right, so that leads us right into the third big myth we need to bust. And this one dominated psychology for a huge chunk of the 20th century. It's the idea that science can only study what it can directly see and measure. Our outward behavior. Chomsky had this absolutely brilliant analogy for this problem. He said that calling psychology a behavioral science is like calling physics a meter-reading science. Think about it. Physicists use readings from their instruments as evidence, right? They use that data to build theories about things they can't see, like gravity or quarks. They don't think their job is to just study the dials themselves. And that's the difference. The old behaviorist approach only looked at the output, the things people do and say. But Chomsky's view, which we can call mentalism, says that's completely missing the point. The real object of study should be the internal system, the mind's software that's generating that behavior. The behavior is just the data. It's not the main event.
To really get why this difference between what's inside your head and what you do is so critical, let's just imagine a guy named Smith. Smith is a totally fluent English speaker, but then he develops a terrible medical condition that makes it impossible for him to speak or understand anything. And then, one day, he gets a miracle cure, and just like that, his ability is completely back to normal.
So here's the question. Did that medicine magically reteach him the entire English language? Of course not. That's absurd. The obvious answer is that his knowledge of English was there the whole time, stored away in his brain, totally safe. It was only his ability to use that knowledge that was gone for a while. See? Knowledge and ability are two very different things.
So when you put all this together, when you bust these big myths about the ghost in the machine, the blank slate, and just focusing on behavior, what you're left with is this incredible, powerful new vision for how to do a science of the mind.
Instead of one big blob we call the mind, the idea is to think of it more like a collection of specialized mental organs. Our capacity for language is one of these organs. It has its own special rules and structure, and it works together with our other mental organs, like our ability with numbers or our visual system. They're just biological components of what makes us human.
And here's a really mind-bending idea about this language organ. You'd think its main job is communication, right? But Chomsky argues that's actually secondary. At its very core, language is a system for computation. It's like biological software that lets us create complex, structured thoughts. It's the engine of human thinking, which we then sometimes choose to share with others. So this new science gives us a pretty solid answer to one of the great mysteries of the mind, Plato's problem, how we know so much on so little evidence. The answer seems to be our innate biological makeup, but it leaves us staring at an even deeper mystery, which we can call Descartes' problem. And that's the creative use of language. Why we say what we say, when we say it, how we come up with new, perfectly appropriate sentences on the fly, that's still profoundly mysterious. So, in a way, we've started to map the mind's biological software. We're figuring out the code that makes thought possible, which is amazing. But the user, the ghost in the machine, you might say, the creative, free-willed person who's actually running that software, well, what explains that boundless creativity? That is the next great frontier.